Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Azure podcast with your hosts, Sam Foote.
And Alan Armstrong.
If you're new here, we're a pair of Azure and Office 365 focused IT security professionals. Each episode, we talk about a specific topic in this space. This week is episode 6 of season 2. We're going to have a chat around Microsoft Entra Azure Active Directory and how it can give you an identity in the cloud. We will go into some of the features and how it can simplify the onboarding of users, as well as how you can secure their digital identities. Hey, Alan, how's it going? Are you ready to have a chat around Azure Active Directory?
Hey, Sam. Yeah, I'm not doing too bad. Yeah, I think it's going to be hard to stick it in 45 minutes. I think we're going to have to maybe
I
do an
yeah,
extended one.
I am thinking that we're going to have to whistle stop tour through a lot of these areas because from what I know, I'm not the expert here. That is Alan. He's in the hot seat to go through Azure AD, but it is a relatively large product with lots of different technologies inside of it, right? So yeah, we're going to have to whistle stop through it. Okay, let's go then. Right. So Alan, can you just give us a really high level? What is Azure AD, Azure Active Directory, and how did it come about?
Yeah, sure. So Azure Active Directory, which is now under the umbrella of Microsoft Entra, is in effect a cloud identity. So a system that allows you to create users to with your username, passwords, with information about their job titles, things like that, that you can use within the Microsoft initially within the Microsoft ecosystem, I guess. So primarily for Office 365 and for Azure. We'll talk about later how we can extend that into other areas. Um, where did it come from? Well, it was kind of hidden, I think, when it initially came out. So when Office 365 first came out or started coming out, um, it was one way to get your identity up into the Office 365. So you didn't have to have different username and passwords, or to enable seamless single sign-on using Azure AD Federation Services, ADFS. That's where it originally sort of started. So I remember doing it with a colleague in a few jobs ago, when we started that journey to seeing how we use SharePoint and Exchange Online in its start.
And do you think that so sort of really early on in its life, it was sort of a bridge from on-premise sort of Active Directory into the cloud, like as you seeing that migration start to happen?
Yeah, definitely. And um, it wasn't really as big as it is today. It wasn't core to anything. It was kind of to use your current username and password in Office 365, you had to do this sync up from your Active Directory to Office 365 at that point. It wasn't really identified as, I guess, from an admin perspective, maybe you've seen it as Active Directory, but it was very hidden. It
And
was,
and yeah, and in that time, were you doing the? Did you were you unknowingly doing the hard work of syncing those accounts up into the cloud, sort of ready for Azure AD to, become what it is today?
yeah. So yeah, it was, in effect Azure AD itself, but it was different. It was different. It was, you had to have a subscription to run it, things like that. Today you don't. Um, and I think there was a lot of configuration you had to do to get the synchronization right, and there wasn't as much feature rich stuff with it. It was just, and like I said, it was more you were syncing accounts into Office 365. You wasn't into Azure AD for Office 365 to do it. The view of it was that's what you were realistically doing, but without sort of not without knowing, but it was a trivial thing, I guess, at that point. We're talking 3, 4, 5 years ago now.
So effectively, you just had that, the Office 365 user administration view that we have now, which is kind of just a proxy on top of Azure AD? Is that just what you were having to use back then? That side of things.
That's probably what you used mostly. There was a back end which was in the the Azure classic environment. That's how this is how old we're talking. Not ARM or Azure Portal with us at this point. And it was very it was very sort of back end kind of thing. It wasn't very friendly, I guess, at that time. You did you got it working, and you got your identities up for Office 365, and everything's completely changed now.
Okay, so can we sort of think about Azure AD as a cloud replacement or brother or sister to on-premise Active Directory? How are they similar, and how do they communicate with each other? Does one replace the other?
So I think there's always I think most organizations now are probably in a hybrid identity state where they've got Active Directory for all their servers and their devices. I mean, if we talk about the episode, couple of episodes back, where we talk about device management using Endpoint Manager, if you've got Azure AD joined devices, then they're directly attached to Azure AD. But most companies are on that move. But um, a lot of users, a lot of organizations that are using Office 365 are definitely in that hybrid state. There's different authentication methods, etc., that they're on their journey. Um, but potentially, I think the journey is up to the cloud. It's not a overnight change. You know, there's things like device management, like we said. As long as if all your devices are already joined, then there's less on Active Directory. If we look at servers and they're in Azure, then you can do Azure AD joined authentication, which means they're not attached to the local AD. Um, so it is that journey, and potentially you can some organizations, new starters, um, small organizations that don't have Active Directory now, can run purely on Azure AD. There's no reason not to. I don't think you would if you're starting. Yeah, if you're greenfield. I don't think unless there's a real requirement, you would spin up Active Directory and manage it because there's we're working in a remote working environment these days as well, whether it's 50-50 or it's full. Um, so you need to be able to access your identity wherever you are anyway.
Okay, so we're really looking at organizations. Okay, let's talk about the majority here and just sort of put them all into a bucket. Um, the majority of existing organizations that maybe have in the past had Active Directory, they're either having to maintain both, synchronize between them, and they are both part of their core parts of their estate, or they are actively trying to remove Active Directory and move to Azure Active Directory as their main identity control plane. Maybe I don't know the best way to describe that, but is that sort of the right take on it?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. We're seeing organizations moving to the cloud where they can, and it might be some functionality within for some functions within the organization take that approach. I mean, the first part is users and their devices, moving them into Azure AD. Well, they're synchronized anyway, but move them solely to only authenticating with their device and that in the cloud. Um, and then it's moving on to the infrastructure. Does something need to be domain joined? Can it be Azure AD joined in Azure to relieve that? And there's a few other bits, and authentication to applications that are on premise. I mean, we'll talk about it briefly in a minute, but can that be done via Azure AD rather than uh, Kerberos? Well, Kerberos can't be used in Azure AD now, but other standard basic authentication things like that, can it be moved to a newer technology for single sign-on? At which point then it's not needed to be domain joined.
And if we sort of think about the proliferation of SaaS based software now, moving away from sort of traditional on-premise server installed software, like let's say you're going to run a Jira or a Confluence. You may decide now not to run like an enterprise version on-prem. You might decide to run the cloud version, and take away that management overhead. Do you feel like that's because from an authentication perspective, a lot of those SaaS providers just simply have like very almost simple, connectors into Azure AD, where if you wanted to do that into Active Directory, it could be more complicated? Do you think it's also driven by an application side of things as well?
Yes, definitely. So, I mean, if we jump onto sort of this, so we talked about the identity, the Azure AD identities being used for Azure and Office 365. Office 365 is a SaaS application, just native to Azure AD. So, there most likely is a SAML connection there, or some sort of authentication that's in the background, that we don't see. But Azure AD gives you the ability to um, single sign on and sometimes provision, depending on the application, into other SaaS applications. So as long as it's using OpenID or SAML 2.0, so these are quite new, not new, but they're the latest sort of versions of these protocols. And most SaaS applications are capable of this, which then means you can have that single identity that someone can sign in without having multiple passwords. This helps towards the potentially the zero trust and the going passwordless, or reducing the amount of passwords you have to look after.
Yeah, because we're sort of also thinking about our identities not just within our own organization. So what we're trying to to get to, I assume, is one singular identity. That would be the most purest form of this, right? That is then federated and shared between a number of applications. Internal, so we'll call that internal of Office 365 and your Azure environment, but then also out, reaching out to the SaaS applications that you bring in for your business.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just it's mostly around. I say mostly. There's two parts to it. There's security, because they've got a single identity, which I guess people might feel, well, if someone takes that, they've got the kingdom. But we put those security controls in place around that identity, and again we'll talk about that in a bit. But also it's the user experience. The user doesn't have to know an extra password. It's not the same password that they're reusing. It's not the same password plus a digit plus a number. I expect we've all been there, where we've got Barbados 10 and Barbados 11, or whatever, or the cat's name plus a number, or whatever it might be, to get you the 10-12 characters you need to try and remember. That's not put on your desk as a post-it. But yeah, it reduces the amount of passwords users need, and they can just go to in Azure AD. There's a My Apps portal where it shows all the apps that you have permission to. You can click on them. The other part to it actually is the management of it. You haven't got to go into those other systems potentially and create the password, send the user the password. It's potentially provisioned by an Azure AD group, and potentially their role within that application, depending on if it's supported. Um, but yeah, so that from a managed perspective, it does simplify, because you're only going to one place to try to manage those identities.
So we're effectively attempting to reduce complexity, also reduce the potential for password reuse and mismanagement of those extra identities, and to ensure um, people have the correct access to you're centrally managing access and roles into certain software as well. um,
Yeah, and it's probably just worth going into that. One part of it really is, when a user leaves, you have to go into those 10, 20, maybe 30 systems to disable their accounts. in this instance, it's potentially disabled on Active Directory, which means it's disabled on Azure AD, which then means it's disabled in all the applications because the identity is Azure AD. So, from a join and move a leaver process, and reducing or turning someone's access off in those applications is a lot simpler.
Okay, so you talked about maybe a potential downside of having a singular identity is, like I think you referred to it as like the keys to the kingdom, right? If I get that one identity, then I've got access to all of these other identities, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
what controls are there in place to actually secure that identity and give us confidence that that situation isn't going to occur?
So there's a couple of things that we can do, and I'll talk about technology at the moment, but let's talk about the organizations that don't want to or aren't in the position yet to do that configuration, because some of it is a little complex. That's why me and you are around to help with that configuration. Um, but if you've got an organization that just wants isn't necessarily complex in how they work, maybe they're all in the UK, and it's a startup. There's 10, 15 users. We're not talking like thousands at this point. Um, Microsoft introduced a year, maybe 2 years ago now. I can't quite remember, but they created this security defaults, and in effect, it enables the multi-factor authentication pieces and some extra sort of bits in the background to basically secure that identity from the day dot. So one part of it is the Azure multi-factor authentication. So when a user gets a new identity in there, where it's been synchronized from Active Directory or it's created on Azure AD, um, they're asked when they first sign in to set up MFA, like we do on other applications. The first thing you do in some applications, is to set up that MFA. So it's not most users are used to that now. Um, Other parts are that it blocks legacy authentication for you, so you don't have to worry about that. And it in when I mean it like some of the legacy authentication being turned off in October anyway from it for Exchange, but yeah, there's a few other bits in there that it basically defaults for you. So that's great. So from a small business, medium business, I guess, you can straight out of the box. There's a little switch that you can turn on, and it says we'll turn the security defaults on, and then that identity is secured in a as a high baseline or a very good security baseline at that point. So that's that part. So to do some of the extra security, some of it you can do. So some of it is um, we can't even talk about licensing. I'm going to leave it till later, but Azure Active Directory has a couple of tiers. So there's Azure Active Directory Basic and 365, and it gives you some basic sort of functionality, like you can create the groups, groups and users, um, and you can force MFA every time the user signs in. So you can do MFA without having the full Azure AD Premium licenses. Um, but so you have the other tiers, so Azure AD Premium P1 and P2. So if we talk about P1, um, that allows you to use conditional access, and conditional access is the gate to to your identity. So this just checks on your location, what device you're coming from. Um, what else is it on there? Let's just think about this. What application you're trying to access, and what it will do then is based on the configuration you give it, it will be able to tell you whether you're allowed access or not. So the example would be that if I'm outside the UK, then I get blocked. So I have to have a UK or a UK IP address in effect. Now someone could come in via a VPN and come from another country into the UK, you know. But what you can also do is you could say that if you're outside the UK, but maybe you're in the EU, then you say you can force MFA all the time. Um, what you can also, so the other parts of that is with the locations, you can specify your egress points. Where does your office come out of, or your corporate VPN come out of? By using that, you can say that if I'm coming from these IP addresses, I don't need to do MFA because I'm from a trusted location. So you can reduce that MFA prompt that users get. So it's that balance of security and um, user adoption or usability, I guess, or the impact on the user.
So conditional access, if I'm sort of digesting this correctly, is sort of applying some logic as people try and access, their identity, to try and add some sort of baseline policies into what they can and can't do. Right. So instead of just saying, we need flexibility in the EU so that people can log in. Let's say we are UK based, and that is where we want, quotes, everybody to access the system from. But some people, some people from the business say, hey, well, I fly out to Amsterdam twice a month to do X, Y, and Z. Then before, you might say, okay, well, we'll just let you connect from anywhere. But now we're able to sort of pinpoint and put logic on where people can access from. I mean, that's just one example of conditional access, right? But essentially, what we're saying there is there's a balance between the enforcement of security policy and usability. Because if you were to just blanket, right, anything that's not a UK IP address, we're just going to drop it. Like, that isn't particularly useful in our currently very connected world that we live in, right? So there are some legitimate use cases for accessing certain information, from a different country, which makes a lot of sense to be able to help secure as best we can, but also give people the flexibility in order to do what they need to do.
Yeah, and that configuration can be done by different subsets of users. So if you've got your UK team, then yes, they can't come out, can't leave, they can't access the application or Azure AD integrated applications from anywhere apart from the UK. But if you've got a Germany or a France team, then yes, you can change that configuration for them so that actually they can't do it from the UK, but they can anywhere in France or Germany. But
So,
they
so,
are allowed from their the corporate IP. So if they're visiting the UK, then they can still access it potentially.
so what you're telling me is conditional access is also conditional for different people in the organization, right? It's
Yeah,
not a global one and done. It's, you can apply specific policies to certain groups inside of your organization.
yeah. So it can be it can get quite complex. Um, and it's as I guess it's kind of as complex as you need it to be. Do you need those different variations? Some organizations don't need that. The main ones that we kind of do are they're not allowed to access anything outside their home or their operating countries because a lot of companies are multi country now. Um, it might be that they want to definitely block certain countries as well. Maybe they don't want no one should ever be communicating from just China, but actually they're free reign around the rest. It could be Russia and it could be other places as well. But um, you can do it that way. You can you can do it, and you can create exceptions as well. So like we said, if there's the CEO that is going everywhere, you just say maybe you just enforce MFA on that person whenever they are outside the UK where they normally reside, kind of thing.
Okay.
So that's conditional access with Azure AD Premium P2 or P1, I should say. You get things like the self-service password reset. So you can reset your passwords in the cloud, but also that can drop down into AD. So you might be able to reduce the amount of help desk calls you get for my password's expired or I can't get into my account. And then there's you can just use the cloud version, get your users to go there. And that reset password can turn up on the front of Windows 10 and Windows 11 as a button at the bottom. So I forgot reset my password, and then they go through a authentication process.
Okay. Great. Is there any other aspects of security within side of Azure AD that you think is
Y-
worth mentioning?
Yeah,
I'm guessing
so
there's lots that you can talk about, but yeah,
yeah,
just
yeah, trying to whistle stop it. Yeah, so if you went up to the Azure AD Premium P2, which is the higher license that you can get at the moment, you get identity protection, and as part of that, it uses Microsoft's intelligent security graph to profile users' sign-ins and users, and this is using what IP address are they coming from and things like that. So it's kind of using that technology from or the logic that we're using already to define our conditional access, but it's doing it and giving it a risk score. So this sign in at this moment in time is currently being flagged as malicious because this IP address is trying 10, 20, 30, 100,000 different tenants to try and log into them. So at this moment in time, it's risky. So it will give it a low, medium, high score. And then within conditional access, you can use that risk score to say, well, if the sign in is high, then just block access. So it's I guess adaptive to the back end of Microsoft's machine learning in the intelligent security graph to identify risky sign-ins. The other part is that you can get risky users, and depending on if you have password hash sync set up, where your on-premise accounts passwords are hashed 2 or 3 times and then synchronized up to Azure AD to do the authentication. And again, we could talk about that for another 45 minutes, but trying to keep it short. Um, Microsoft buy password lists when they get leaked or they grab them from the dark web, and then they hash them up like they would the other ones, your passwords, and then they can compare them. So they don't know what the passwords are, but they compare them, and if they see a match with the username and the password, then it flags it as a high risk, so that you can identify that there's been a leaked credential, and then with conditional access, you can force a password reset to remove that risk.
yeah, it sounds great. So not only can you set these not static but variable conditional access policies, you can then also take, I assume, some sort of decision engine, artificial intelligence, and the rest of their knowledge that they have with other customers and what's going on inside of their whole ecosystem to then come up with a risk based score for any sort of like sign in or identity activity. Yeah.
Yeah, and just quickly, one of the other uh, indicators for conditional access is the device that they're coming from. And like I said, you can do it based on compliant devices, and that's based on endpoint managers. Is it been managed by that? Is it a hybrid join device, etc.? So there's some other indicators there that you can use to reduce the amount of MFA prompts, things like
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great. So what I know about users and people is they're not static.
that.
So I think it might be worth just trying to understand how Azure Active Directory attempts to help with the management of the life cycle of a specific user, and because that's always been a tricky problem to solve. I think that's probably fair to say,
Yeah.
and I can imagine that if we have a should we call it a child of Active Directory, a sibling of Active Directory? I don't know. How they've sort of they've tried to combat this problem, in this cloud first approach.
Yeah, so if we talk about the synchronization between Active Directory and Azure AD, if a user is created in the right organization unit, OU, that is synchronized, then their identity turns up in the cloud, and their their authentications will then work with active Azure AD at that point, depending on which authentication method has been chosen. And again, we could talk 20 minutes about that. And the same thing of if a user's role information's changed in Active Directory, then it's synchronized, and if they're disabled or deleted, then they're removed from Azure AD. So it is a two-way, a one-way synchronization there. So if you've got a join and move a leave process already in place on prem, then it's going to help. It's going to contribute towards your identity in Azure. AD. But if we talk about Azure AD directly, there's a couple of things that it can do. So we talked about the SaaS application. So based on it, if someone's in a group or they get added to an application that is, it federated with Azure AD, then their identity can potentially be provisioned in the other application. And again, added, roles changed, information change, and disabled based on their Azure AD identity being changed or coming from the AD sync, AD Connect sync. So that's really powerful because you ain't got, like we said before, you haven't got to worry about going into every application, disabling accounts when they leave, or changing their job title in every application, things like that. But one part they have brought in is provisioning of users directly into Active Directory from a HR system. So there are the list is growing bigger of supported HR systems, and they're SaaS systems normally. So one of them is Workday, and another one is this is a SAP one. I can't remember the name of it. And there's a few others now that I've not looked into yet. But those systems, when a user's created, then they can be synchronized into Active Directory with all their information. And when you set things like their start date, activate their account then, or if they've handed their notice in, then you can set the expiry date of their account, and then it's synchronized. So you can leave your provisioning of users down to your HR team, because in effect it's them creating their accounts in the HR system to pay, to set up their pay and everything and deal with that part, and then their
Is
accounts are created.
is that connector, because you said there's a Workday and a SAP product, that a SAP based product that is supported with that at the moment? Is that like that connection that has to be made from a HR system? I assume must be not bespoke per customer, but bespoke to that, that SaaS like HR system, right? Like, as in, there's not, is there like a, if you had your own HR system, could you like connect that, or are we sort of waiting for that first party integration to come from Microsoft?
Yeah, so at the moment they are connectors in the application gallery in Azure AD to do that provisioning from the HR systems, and there are more coming. Um, but yes, at the moment there isn't anything to build. To, in effect, have your own HR system do that um, provisioning. At the moment, there are other tools that can do it for you, like Microsoft Identity Manager. It's still licensed against Azure AD licensing at the moment, so you can use that to do that transition, because it doesn't have to necessarily talk to on-prem AD to do that provisioning. Um,
So any logic that you would have to build inside of uh, MIM has already been rolled up for you for Workday and this other product, quite nicely
yeah,
already.
yeah. So there's an interface in effect to build the transformations to do
Okay.
that matching against what fields in that HR system is to what fields in Active Direct in Azure AD,
Yeah.
and what fields you want to fill,
And
populate,
the
that sort
actual
of stuff.
connector to those HR systems are provided by Microsoft, and the mapping of the schema has already been done. And then you've just got to sort of wire up the correct fields to
Yeah,
both sides,
yeah. I
if
think
that
most
makes
of it
sense.
will be in place. It's whether you have any changes that you want to make, like maybe you've added an extra field or in the HR system if you're able to, or you're using fields not in a different way. Maybe I, there may be different things you want to pull over. Um, yeah,
Okay, so for JML, a cloud based identity is going to have its own sort of natural benefits, because it is already hopefully connected to those other applications that you're using that are maybe SaaS based applications. But also, if there is a connection to your specific HR system at the moment, and my assumption is there will be more in the future, that you can get that complete synchronization between those two systems, as people move into and around and then out of your business.
yeah, and like I said, there are more connectors coming in. They've got some on their list. There's also other um, functionality coming that is currently being built that I can't talk about at the moment. That is helping with potentially that extra customization on other things, which might be as well as provisioning into other applications that aren't in Azure AD. Maybe they are on premise and they are a bit bespoke. That you have to provision them in a different way. Um, you know, Updating a SQL table maybe to add users, things like that. That's not SAML or OpenID kind of technology.
Okay, so we've talked about users users identities and bits and bobs like that, and around the security of it and how apps integrate and things like that. But how do we manage permissions? How does Azure AD help us manage permissions in, say, Office 365, Azure, and even potentially other apps that we've integrated?
Yeah, so we kind of talked about this, that some of the SaaS applications give you the capability to provision roles directly in Azure AD. Some of it has to be done on the application side. So it depends on what's supported. Um, Office 365 and Azure AD have their administrator roles, global admin, security admin, etc. Um, so you can give users permissions for that, but with the Azure AD Premium P2, you can use something called privileged, privileged identity management. And what that allows you to do is um, give just enough access or just in time access to that role with a workflow. So that means that your Exchange admin maybe that doesn't necessarily need Exchange admin all the time because they only go in there to make a change. Um, they can request that role for say 4 hours of the day because they're going to make a change. So it means that if potentially a bad actor was able to get their account, they don't automatically have that role to cause damage. They're able to, they would have to request elevation, and that is flagged um, and audited kind of thing. So to be able to elevate, you can have the option to require MFA, so you can't just do it. And that doesn't mean that when you're in the office and we have conditional access that says you don't need MFA, it ignores that and says right, you'll elevate into a higher role. We're now going to do MFA and prove that it's you. There is another bit where you can actually get approval. So maybe when you got global admins, and the default for or the recommendation from Microsoft Secure Score is no more than, I think it's more than one, less than five. Um, you can have users elevate to that role to do a global change to the Azure AD slash um, Office 365 environment because some things just need global admin to do it, and that can go through an approval process. So you can say that if you need this, then these two users one of them has to approve it, and then you have to give a justification. Um, Now, maybe you're doing a change out of hours, so no one's going to be, at 2 o'clock in the morning, no one's going to be around. So what you can do is when you're doing that request, you can specify a time that you want it. So you can say, I need global admin at 2 a.m. for an hour because I'm doing this change. And then it goes off to the approvers. They can see what time you want it and they can approve it or reject it. So it's given that control um, at that level to restrict access and potentially give some standard users some elevated roles that they can request if they need it. So we've kind of talked about the Azure AD roles, but within Azure you can do the same thing. You can use privileged identity management to give someone owner or contributor into a subscription management group or even resource group. So again, you can give just-in-time access to that environment.
So when we're talking about just-in-time access, just for a minute, let's just focus on this in terms of Active Directory, right? Because you've got your standard role-based access control, let's say. and you've so you've got Alan in your organization, right? And he handles everything. Alan's your only IT guy, so he is de facto global admin, let's say, right? Um, and so in traditional Active Directory, you would just assign him like global administrator, yeah, like as in it would be because is there a comparable like system inside of Active Directory for PIM? Like, could you do this where like Alan is a global admin, but maybe only for half an hour a day when he's sorting out other people's tickets or whatever. That's a really bad example, but do you get what I'm saying? Like, is
So,
is is PIM a feature only available to this new cloud like identity system?
so the privileged entity management pin that I'm talking about is only for Azure AD perspective. Um, there natively there isn't anything in Active Directory to give that just-in-time access. There are other products out there that can do that. I don't know them off the top of my head, but there are third-party applications or software that can run on premise to do that process in effect.
So,
Um,
so traditionally, there's no first-party support for a just-in-time access, a process within Active Directory. But now with PIM, that is first-party, right? For Azure AD. So, unless you're going to the effort of, say, procuring and licensing another piece of software to, I assume, bolt onto the side of your Active Directory, um, you're potentially you're potentially able to get functionality that you never previously had before with Azure Active Directory.
yeah, yeah, and one thing we've noticed with users in the moving to PIM is that that they're a little frustrated about the process they've got to go through because beforehand they could just log in and go and do whatever they want. Where now they've got to do that potentially approval process or just elevate. Um, so there's a little bit of restriction or a little bit of resistance, I guess, because it is a little bit hinderous, I guess. But generally, it's not too bad. I mean, we use it, don't we, with customers and things like that, and it's not too bad. It's relatively quick to get that role as well, and from our perspective at least, I feel safer that I don't just walk into a customer and I've got global admin and I'm like,
Yeah,
okay.
without a doubt. I don't know. Maybe it's just because we do a lot of consultancy, but could you imagine just like I suppose you'd physically have to potentially if you went on site and they gave you like a laptop and like a proper you know a machine to use and an actual account inside of AD. Could you imagine just having like global admin with no like audit trail, or that just sounds like a professional indemnity nightmare waiting to happen, right? So yeah, I do absolutely love PIM because it's like especially from the Azure side, because that's the world that I live in, mostly. And it's like I'd love owner to these subscriptions just for half an hour, just to do something right that we've all agreed, should be conducted. I'm happy to give a justification, and I'm happy to drop that role as soon as I possibly can because, yeah, I don't want to accidentally say deploy something into the wrong subscription or resource group accidentally, right? So yeah, I'm a massive fan of. I do get it, especially if you've got a PIM elevation that you want to do that requires full approval, and you are it's no, it's not a Friday afternoon because we don't change stuff on a Friday afternoon. But it's on a Monday when the person on the client side that has to approve them is off on holiday for a couple of days. I get that, and they haven't left somebody else in charge. Do you see what I mean? Like there's just been a lapse in process. But generally, on the whole, yeah. But I could understand if you were internal to a business and all you did was third line support for a company, having to justify every time that you wanted to elevate up to fix something for some, a ticket that's come in, I could imagine that that becomes quite onerous. But I have also seen on the other side, I've seen a lot of customers that are now wanting that level of detail for their audit requirements, to understand what has happened in what has happened in their estate. Because I think that's an area, I come from the software side where absolutely everything is tracked, but from a IT perspective, for a long time, that's been reliant on documentation and communication to bridge the gap of like what has actually happened in the estate, and what is and managing change.
Yeah, so you can have, we're talking about eligibility here versus active, active account all the time. Um, and you may have service accounts that can't, elevate because they're running a service, and that's okay. It's not, we're not saying that you should use it all the, it doesn't fit everything, but it might be that maybe for a third line support engineer, they don't need to do that approval process, but maybe a level two that's going to go up to a higher tier might need that level, that third line to approve it, maybe because they want them, they're delegating that, what they're doing, kind of thing. So it's different, it is customizable in that way. So we've kind of talked about the Azure AD roles, the Azure roles, but you can do privileged access groups, which is in preview at the moment. It's been in preview for a year and a half now, so it's been out for a while. But in effect, you can approve someone to be a member of that group, and that group could be, give you a global admin role, an example. So what this does is it allows you to have more flexibility on what that subset of users has to do to get added as a member, which gives them global admin or a role within Azure. Because within the Azure AD groups, the native ones, you can only set up one configuration. So if you say that global admins have to, or exchange admins have to approve all the time, and you've got your third line support guy or girl, having to um, approve every time, and you want to change that, then you can move into a privileged access group that does it for you. Well, what privileged access groups then give you is that you can use them in your SaaS applications because they're just a group. I say just a group. Um, they're a group. They act as a security group, which means that then you can assign them, to an application, and then potentially into a role, which means that then someone can elevate into that role in that SaaS application. So it gives you that extra, being able to give PIM or use PIM in other applications.
Okay, that sounds really powerful, and I assume because of the now more complex, number of applications that you've got, and managing access to them, and also ensuring that permissions creep doesn't happen. And we're definitely gonna have to run a whole episode on permissions management now, with Entra, aren't we?
Yeah.
And talk about how this all fits together as well, because that might be a good another one to do, because that can also show you how just simply assigning roles and permissions to people, as you go, can lead to a huge amounts of permissions creep, right? So yeah, we'll definitely go through that. So let's just we're at 48 minutes, so let's try and cap this off. But we need to talk about licensing, because I my assumption is it sounds very powerful, so it sounds very valuable to organizations. So is Azure AD very expensive? Is it layered? How's licensing and packaging of functionality sort of handled with Azure AD?
So, like I said at the beginning, there is some free tier, so you can get. I think it's basic tier, and there's an Office 365 tier. So if you've got Office 365 licensing, you can use it there, and that allows you to use that standard security defaults functionality where you can't customize anything; it's done for you. So that's the base. Um, and then you've got Azure AD Premium P1, and that gives you conditional access, the ability to be more dynamic with Azure MFA, um, gives you self-service password reset, seamless single sign-on, and password protection, which I've not even talked about because we just don't have time. But in effect, it stops users from creating bad passwords, and you can create a bad password list internally. So maybe you've got your organization 123. You can just remove all like those sort of passwords out of it, and that can go onto on-prem AD. Um, so that's that. And then when you move to Azure Premium P2, then you get the identity protection, you get the privileged identity management, and then you get a bit that I haven't had a chance to talk about, which is the identity governance. And identity governance, in effect, is um, access review. So you can review if someone still needs access to this group or application. And you can also create access packages where you can say users can request this access package, and it gives them access to these groups, these applications, these SharePoint sites, these teams. So it might be that you have a finance access package, and then you can either manually assign someone to it, you can base it on a group, or someone can request access to it, so that it then gives them all the permissions. So kind of using sort of your RBAC model kind of thing with it. um and yeah, I think that's the two. There's only two premium tiers at the moment. And I think that's everything covered in it. There's probably some few things that I've missed, because it keeps changing all the time.
Okay, so not particularly that complex to get your head around in terms of licensing, because we've essentially got a free sort of entry base level tier, then we've got a P1 and a P2 with just different varying levels of functionality. And I assume that the P2 functionality is more geared to, say, the enterprise, where things are a little bit more complicated. Like, like you just said, like a finance access package, maybe they need three roles, or whatever they need, to be able to say three groups or something like that.
Yeah,
Just
or if
being able
you've
to
got
automate some of that.
or if you've got a small admin team that you want to do privileged identity management with, you can just license those users as well. So you can just tier up those users that need to
Okay.
do the PIM side of things. So you don't have to
Yeah.
license everyone, but you can get the best functionality for your IT admins.
Yeah. So you could just license your most like important users. The ones that could the identities that could do most damage. If they were compromised, and allow you to help control that access a little bit more. Okay. And just quickly, if we didn't use Azure AD, what would we use?
So there's a couple out there, and to be honest, you'll still have Azure Active Directory somewhere because it's the only authentication for Azure, IaaS, PaaS, and Office 365. So you will have Azure AD. Just depends on what tiering or what you use it for. But you can federate it with um, Okta. So Okta can be the identity provider, and then Okta can do the single sign-on into the other SaaS applications as well as into Azure AD for Office 365. Um, there are some other ones out there. Ping Identity is one of them, and I think there's a couple more out there that I can't think off the top of my head. But a lot of we're seeing a lot of organizations start to realize that they're buying licensing anyway because they buy a Microsoft 365 E3 or an EMS E3. They're already paying for Azure AD Premium 1, which can give you all that functionality. In fact, it's probably best to mention that the I think it was some of the single sign-on stuff is Premium P1. So if you want to start integrating with SaaS applications, you have to be at P1. So really, P1 is probably your best bet to start off with, at least um, from a licensing perspective. But yeah, we're seeing a lot of users starting to cost save or realize that actually Azure AD now is capable because, you know, 3 or 4 years ago, 2, 3, 4 years ago, it probably wasn't as good as as Okta or as Ping Identity, that sort of stuff. But now, there's a lot that is comparable, and there's very little that's different now. And actually, bringing those technologies in actually makes the user experience complex.
So maybe we've gone from a little, full circle here where Microsoft starts to um, integrate identity into Office 365 and Azure. There are gaps to fill in terms of functionality. We've seen other companies and other companies and software come up to maybe plug some of those holes because maybe the speed at which Microsoft rolls out. I mean, they do roll out a lot, but in terms of they've got a larger state of software that they have to manage, right? So, but now what you're saying is we've sort of gone back to a tipping point where a lot of organizations, if they rely on Office Suite, for instance, um, they can be licensed for a lot of this already, or they've got some element of their identities in Azure AD because they've got to be able to authenticate, say, against Azure and Office 365, so that an uplift to a P1 is actually relatively minor compared to the cost of a full bore, say, Okta, subscription or something like that, right? Um, and then you get back to this singular identity control plane, don't you? Which I think we should have a whole episode on just as one go. But yeah, I kind of understand that as well. But if I am an organization that does have an Okta or a Ping, I can still integrate, into Azure AD and get some of that level of But I'm just probably going. My main source of identity is those external systems, I'd assume, right? And we're federating like out to Azure AD at that point, aren't we? Because the source of truth for identity is, say, like an Okta. That's the center of their universe potentially.
Yeah, it it depends because if a lot of the users have got an Active Directory, and then they synchronize their identities to Okta, but they're also synchronizing their identities to Azure AD, and then they're
Yeah,
doing the matching
yeah,
from Okta to
yeah,
Azure AD, and
yeah.
then um,
So
but
that probably also adds a layer of complexity as well, right? When you've got potentially like three identity platforms to control, manage, and also have the knowledge and skills in house to do all of that work, right?
yeah,
That can be a challenge.
yeah, absolutely. And like I said, you're pretty much going to be managing Azure AD anyway, because if you're an Office 365 user or organization, then you're going to have it and you're going to use it. So it's that kind of depending on what you do and what you're using in those other third party identity providers. Can you do majority of it in Azure AD? I mean, I sound like I'm preaching to move, but it's a realistic
That is your
ask.
job, Alan.
Yeah, I know, but we don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, we say how it is. It's
No, yeah, yeah, and I think that's quite a good point to make. Really, is that sometimes it would all be nice for it to be in one place, but then there's the real world that gets involved in terms of money, contracts, and commercials. That gets involved. Because moving between these systems takes a lot of effort and a lot of work, doesn't it? We've got commercial contracts that are in place and things like that. So I think it is worth mentioning that um, Alan and I, especially, we do like to approach a request that comes in from a client, and we do a discovery to understand what they're trying to achieve, and you know, um, in this example, whether a move to Azure AD, as a singular place for their identities would actually be of overall net benefit to the business, right? So I think that is, and I think that should come across as well in all of our podcast episodes. Is we are heavily focused on Microsoft and Microsoft technologies, um, but we are acutely aware that other people exist in the world, and we all have to play nice in the sandbox together, don't we?
yeah,
Because effectively, as technologists or IT or whatever you want to refer yourself as to, essentially here we're just here to make users' lives easier, right? and a user doesn't care where their identity is stored, right? They might do, if there's a breach or something like that, but day to day, they just want to make sure that they can access their HR systems so they can book their holiday, or and all of those. And that's just a very basic scenario. But okay, let's we're literally at an hour right now, so I'm going to hard cut it now. Anything that we haven't talked about in Azure AD, we will cover with separate topics. um Alan will kick himself at the end of this podcast episode, I promise you, and he
Yeah.
will write furious notes into other episodes. So don't worry about it if we missed it. So let's just do a quick reflection. Let me just, mirror back to you sort of what I've learned and what you've been talked about. So Azure AD is a cloud first way to obtain an identity, and Azure AD is really focused on authenticating against those cloud systems and also other SaaS applications that you will be integrating with. It's not a replacement for Active Directory. It's simply a different way of managing identities in a different environment. There's still communication that goes on between Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, and that will continue for, I assume, many years to come. We're also utilizing Azure AD to secure conditional access to people's identities. We may use security defaults, or we might go on and actually produce our own set of conditional access policies that we might want to put into our organization. Management of user lifecycle is obviously possible, and there are some first party connections to HR systems now, so you don't have to potentially go down the MIM route and sort of build your own synchronization engine there. But if you do want to go down that route, and maybe you do have more custom requirements there, that is still possible. It's not a lockdown system. You can talk to it and you can control it automatically. And also, we've got things like PIM and PAG to secure our most valuable accounts, mainly administrative accounts, because the people that manage these systems usually have high permissions creep, where, as we spoke about, you may have a global admin that can just do anything they like at any time. And that could be relatively dangerous if that identity was breached at some point. Is there anything else that I've missed there, Alan? Does that sound pretty fair? Good
Yeah,
representation?
the only thing I'd say is, like you said, around it's not, Azure AD isn't a replacement for Active Directory. Potentially it is, but it's not like we said, it's a journey. It's a definite journey to go there, because there's going to be a lot of legacy capability that still needs on-prem AD, and like you said, it's going to be years before potential companies can move. But it's a
Okay.
journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is the potential to be a replacement for Active Directory, but maybe businesses and maybe the maturity of the product isn't there to get them to that place maybe at this time. Is what you're sort of saying for
Yeah,
the
there's a
majority of
lot. There's
people?
a lot of
Yeah.
change and a lot of
Okay.
different thinking around how you manage things. So it's a lot of transformation.
Yeah, and identity is really the core of IT, isn't it? Right.
Yeah.
So it's quite a scary thing
Yes.
to move around and
Yes.
change, right? So yeah,
Exactly.
we can imagine the things. Okay, let's wrap it up there for Azure AD. So next episode is going to be me in the hot seat. We are going to talk around the cloud adoption framework. And essentially, this is a framework to help you structure your cloud environments to best migrate potential, say, workloads from your on-premise infrastructure into the cloud. Effectively, what we're trying to do is trying to put some best practice and some structure in around Azure before it becomes Wild West, and everybody and the product team get their hands on it. So if you have enjoyed this episode, Please do consider subscribing if you'd like to listen to more of this sort of content in the future. We have so many more topics that we want to cover, and your listens and support is what will continue to fuel the podcast going forward.
We also have the ability to give us some feedback. Did you enjoy this episode? Did I definitely miss something with Azure AD? Any thoughts? Um, there should be a link in the show notes to be able to give us some feedback. Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Great. Okay, cool. Thanks very much for your time today, Alan. That was a great run through of Azure AD, and we managed to do it in an hour and 5 minutes, which I think was actually quite respectable for Azure AD. We did know this was going to be an absolute beast, so apologies to everybody that had to listen to this at like 2 times speed to get through it. But yeah, it's been a bit of a thing, and like we said, we'll break out to some other episodes about some specific thing because like governance and access packages could just be one episode just by itself. So
Yeah.
let's put that in the diary to get that across. Okay, thanks very much for listening, and we'll speak to you guys. See you guys in the next one. Cheers.
Yeah. Speak to you soon.